We hope to live up to that proposal, Leo, along with the good noble spirits. What are passions? Just by a raise of hands, does anyone in this room have a passion? 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 people? Oh, 5. A little hand goes up in the back. Yay. Why are we so reluctant to say we have passions? Is it that there's a bad connotation to the word? Yeah. Most of the time, if you Google passions, if you're not reading about the passion of the Christ, you're reading about how to combat passion or how to indulge yourself in passion. So it kind of has a bad rap. So along with the guidance of the noble spirits and our mentors, we have tried to re-educate one another on the passions and understanding it, defining it through the Spiritist philosophy, through science, through the Oxford Dictionary, and through different scenarios, different cases. So bear with me as I tell you an actual true story. I grew up learning her name as Madame Curie. Some call her Madame Marie Curie. Doesn't matter how you call her name, she's pretty famous. And she's pretty well known for her discoveries, which are amazing in science, for radium and radioactivity. And she even won 2 Nobel Prizes, and she was first at that time to be a woman to really be awarded Nobel Prizes. But what's even more fascinating is if you dig a little bit deeper into her biography is how she reached that point. She became famous naturally because of her discoveries along with her work she did with her husband, Pierre Curie. But what they don't normally tell you in textbooks is the struggle that she went through. She was the youngest of 5 children. Her father was a teacher of physics and math, I believe. And she had a passion, like her father, to learn about the math and the sciences. Probably she learned it from her father, who also was passionate. But one of her sisters, her name is Bronia, if I'm even saying it correctly, it's a Polish name, wanted so much to study. But as it were in the 1912, during that time period, women, the only place in Warsaw to study was at an all-men college. So she naturally was not allowed. So at that time, actually, they had an underground classes where you would go in secret to study. Can you imagine? And people were really women were so anxious to study that they had to go in secret. Nowadays, we find our teenagers and our 20-some-year-old children who have no desire to go to college whatsoever or don't have direction. Yet at that time, people were, at least women, were dying, really, really risking their name, their honor of their family to go and study in secret. But Marie Curie and her sister Bronia were very determined, especially Marie Curie, because she came up with an idea. She made a proposition to her sister. She said to her, Bronia, and I'm paraphrasing, forgive us, Miss Curie, wherever you are, we have to come up with an idea. So they decided to travel to a different place in a different city far away. If my memory doesn't fail me, it was someplace in France, where they were able to study, but they had to pay a lot of money, which they did not have. So Marie turned to her sister and said, Bronia, look, we both have such a desire to study. I want to study. I love to read and research. So this is the deal. While you study, I'll become what in modern terms would be called a nanny or a governess and do other jobs just to pay for your college. And that's what she did for a number, I think it was 5 years she did this. So her sister could go and study. And then in turn, her turn came. So can you imagine? And they even say that for those 5 years or more, she lived off bread and butter. And oftentimes she got very ill because of that. Can we imagine living off bread and butter? Probably not. But there are some struggling college students out there who I'm sure live off something to that effect. But so we see the passion she had. We'll talk about some other cases here today, and you'll see different cases of passion. This is a case of passion that led to someplace good. There's another case on passion, if we so can call it that, because it's not called that in this book, which I can't reach, 2,000 years ago. And it's the case of Plinius Severus and Agrippa Severus. They're both brothers, Roman by birth, And we recommend you guys to go and read the whole book. It's absolutely amazing. And if not, there is the audio soap opera in Portuguese that has dramatized the whole thing in Portuguese, unfortunately, not in English yet. But in any event, Plinius and Agrippa were brothers. They got along pretty well. But the problem was that there was another girl named Flavia. She was the daughter of the Roman senator Publius Lentulus, if we're saying the name correctly. And the issue with that was that both brothers were in love with her, except that Plinius, even when Flavia was probably 5 or 6 years old or somewhere around that age, was absolutely determined to marry her. And he even requested that from her father, and of course he gave it to her. So he was already betrothed to her at a very young age. So here we have a case where both brothers were absolutely passionate about this young girl, Flavia, that she grows up to be a beautiful young woman who is very desired by actually many people, not just these two brothers. But the interesting thing is how each one decided to take their life. See, here we have passion on one end being a good thing, and passion could be a bad thing. As we talked about Marie Curie, she took her passion for science and she really progressed. Not only did she do for herself, but as a society, we gained a lot from x-rays, from medicine. So we owe her a lot. But in this case, this is more of a personal story of passion. So what happened? Without giving away the entire book, we will say this, that Plinius actually did wind up marrying Flavia, and Agrippa, his brother, could have tried to, as many people at that time and other times in life, he could have tried to steal his brother's wife. He could have. But under the counsel of their wise mother, she said, Agrippa, he's your brother. You must love and respect that this is already a pre-prepared marriage, preordained. It was already meant to be. So what did he do? He decided to travel far away for years just so he can allow his brother and his brother's wife to be happy. He renunciated his life. So here we have another case. But there are also many other cases we could tell of the opposite. And in this book, there's plenty of alternate, passionate scenes. Because when we define passion, what is the definition of passion? Do we think, as I first asked the question, how many of you have passions? Many of you were reluctant to answer right away because there's that negative connotation. There's that stigma like, oh, do I admit that I have a passion? Yes. Passions are not bad. As Marie Curie, it's not bad. But the Oxford Dictionary says it's this. Passion is strong, barely controllable emotion, a state or outburst of strong emotion, intense sexual love, an intense desire or enthusiasm for something, or a thing arousing great enthusiasm. So we see it could be a passionate love affair, but it could be, like Marie Curie, passionate about science or something that we do. And part of our talk today is also understanding the foundations of what passion is. This is where we're going to begin to see that passions are not bad. And in the Spirit's book, Observation of Question 908, they describe this, that passion in itself is not bad. I mean, the principle, the foundation of truth lies in sentiment or our needs. But what happens with passions is that it's an exaggeration of a need or sentiment. So the problem lies in the excess, not in the cause itself. And we'll give an example. And they also go on to say that such excess becomes evil when it results in some kind of evil. So of course, inversely, the opposite is true. If in your excess of passion, it results in something good, like Marie Curie, that's fantastic. If you're passionate about something and you change lives, that's great. We can say Steve Jobs was passionate about his job. We have the iPhone today and many other things. Has it helped humanity? The iPad, has it helped humanity? Yeah, probably. Sure. Medicine today, the iPhone is so easy to use in the hospitals and physicians, passing information along. So it makes things more simpler, makes things more easier. So one important thing for us to know, that passions are not wrong. It's just a matter of where we take that passion. Now, one could even say that pretty much entails the entire talk, but it's a little bit more complicated than that. And we'll understand why. In the question 907, Kardec asks this question. He says, since the principle of our passions is natural, are they evil per se? The spirits tell us no. Passions is a result of excess brought about by the will. Though the principle itself was given to humans for their good, the passions can lead them to do great things. The abuse to which they yield themselves is what makes them evil. So this is just for us to have an idea, to reiterate again that these are not our words. We're not making it up. We are not deriving conclusions from the air. We're studying Spiritism, and the spirits tell us in the Spirits book that passions are not bad. It's just the excess and the evil or the negativity that comes out of it that's bad. And believe it or not, we are quite surprised when we are researching this subject to find that there's actually research about passions. We really didn't think we'd find this. I don't know why we didn't think that, but there's actually a really well-known researcher and psychologist and full professor at the university in Canada, Quebec. He actually did extensive research. He was first of like a handful of researchers and psychologists who decided that they wanted to study the passions in depth to really understand it. And he defines it as this, and his name is Dr. Robert Vallerand. He defines it as a strong inclination toward an activity that people like, find important, and in which they invest time and energy. And a really good example he gives, and we'll go into his model, which is this, is that there's two types of passion per him. There's harmonious passion and there's obsessive passion. And one of the examples he gives, and I'll kind of make it more appropriate for our audience, is that you have a man that loves soccer. Now, this man loves soccer, has a great passion for it, but then one day he gets injured. Now, the harmonious soccer passion lover, whatever, the harmonious passion, if he gets hurt, he would say to himself, okay, I sprained my leg, let me spend some weeks recuperating, I'll ice it, I'll be good. But Dr. Vallerand says an obsessive passion, or someone who's obsessed about that particular thing, would react as follows. Would look at his sprained ankle and say, forget about it, I'm going to play anyway. So therein, that's destructive, and that's an obsessive passion. Obsessive passion being something that just has control over us, and we don't control it. So it's really important to make that distinction when we describe passions, because then we have to ask ourselves, what is my passion? And which one of these is it? And this is not too far from Spiritism when the spirits tell us that the passions are levers that increase humans' powers tenfold and help them to fulfill the designs of providence. But if instead of directing them, they allow themselves to be directed by them, they fall into excess, and the very power in which in their hands could do good falls upon them and crushes them. And he gives many examples of different vices, of gambling and many different other things in excess of foods or cigarettes or workaholics to the detriment of the families of those who are workaholics. Anything that is to the excess where you're not only hurting yourself or others. So something for us to think about. What are our passions? What are we passionate about? And what about the non-passionate people? Is it bad not to have passion? Yes? Do we think it's bad not to have passion? Yes? It's not a trick question. Just wanting to know what everyone thinks. Some say yes, some say no. At least according to Dr. Vallerand, he says something very interesting. He says, it's not bad to not have passion, but it becomes a problem when you have no motivation. Because sometimes people just, and he says this, interesting enough, he says some people just are not at that level yet where they have a passion for something or for life, but they're just sort of, going along, but they're still motivated to live life. So he says, if you're not passionate about things, it's okay. But if you lack motivation, it's something to worry about. And Joanna DeAngelis, in one of her books, I'm not remembering off the top of my head if it's Recipes for Peace or Living and Loving, which are all exceptional books. And she mentions this throughout many different books she writes about enthusiasm. and not to lose our enthusiasm, especially when we go through hard times in our lives, which all of us do. Dr. Vallerand also goes on to describe harmonious passion, and he gives it this definition. With harmonious passion, the activity occupies a significant but not overpowering space in the person's identity and is in harmony with other aspects of the person's life. So we don't even have to deem something passionate. We can just ask ourselves, are our activities that occupy a better part of our time in our life, are they creating harmony with the aspects of our personal life and with others? It's a simple question we can ask ourselves. Are they? Because he describes the opposite about obsessive passions. He says obsessive passions are the following: strong desire to engage in the activity that eventually gets out of control. Is there something that we have partaken in, that we do, that initially didn't seem like a bad idea, but then it just sort of seemed to get out of control? You very well may be an obsessive passion. He also defines it as person can't help him or herself. Passion must run its course. Now, when we tie this into Spiritism, we could talk about obsession in and of itself, because we know that unlike Dr. Vallerand, who to our knowledge isn't aware of spirit influence in our lives, we know very much that our obsessors can constantly be whispering to us to do things that actually do become an obsessive passion because of why? Our will is weak. That lever that we talk about is merely our willpower. There's no secret, really. When we watch some videos in Dr. Vallerand, when we did our research into the human psyche, we realized a lot of people are looking for the fast way to get well or thin, or what's the secret? The secret is there is no secret. It's just hard work, and we'll learn that. Obsessive passion is also defined as something that creates conflict with the person's other activities, and also leads to negative emotional consequences and too rigid persistence. So we ask ourselves, how do we figure that out if something is causing a negative emotional consequence? It sounds so technical. How do we find out if something is giving us a bad feeling in the end? Is this what Spiritism tells us? When we do something wrong and then later we feel bad for it, then probably we've done something that wasn't right because our conscience is calling our attention, the laws of God?
Maybe when our passion becomes frustration.
Maybe when our passion becomes a frustration? Sure. When would a passion become a frustration?
When you don't achieve what you want from that project that you have a passion for project.
That's interesting, and we will talk about that idea of when we are passionate about something and then it doesn't give us what we think it's going to give us. That's an interesting concept, and it happens to a lot of us. It's a part of us growing in our evolutionary process and also accepting that what we think is right for us doesn't mean is what is in our reincarnatory plan. Just like the two brothers, Agrippa and Plinius, Agrippa really wanted Flavia as his wife, but he was able to renounce himself and to move far away. Can we distinguish right now in our lives what our harmonious and obsessive passions are? If we have them, are we able to make that distinction? Yes, maybe? Something for us to think about? But Spiritism explains further for us. They say a passion becomes harmful at the moment in which you cease to govern it, and when it results in any injury to yourselves or to another. This is interesting because Joanna de Angelis, when she talks in many of her books, and she talks about before you take a decision, before you make a decision, think about the decision that will be the least harmful for yourself, but especially others. So if you're passionate about something and you're not sure what you should do, I'm really passionate about surfing, but I know that if I take every day to go to the beach, I probably might lose my job and my husband probably won't like me anymore and it'll be a mess. So you reserve yourself to the appropriate time. But if I'm truly obsessed, I might go and do those things. And usually we find these vices. We find the obsessive passion often in the vices. Alcoholic drinking, partying, those things. But let's share this really interesting case. It's the case of Mike Mattis. It's in this really amazing documentary. It's called This Emotional Life. It's by Dr. Dan Gilbert, who's a social psychologist at Harvard University. And it's an amazing documentary, and it's on Netflix for those of you who have it. If not, you could purchase it online. And he researches a lot of different social groups, and he actually comes upon this really interesting story. And there's a young guy who kind of had it difficult from the beginning. He was born into a family where his mom was a single mom who lived with her mother. So he essentially grew up with his mom and his grandmother. And that's how it was. His mother worked 2 jobs as a waitress and as something else to help sustain their life. And that's how it was for many years until one day the grandmother died. And after that, it was just him and his mom. And Mike Mattis, as he tells his story, he says, well, that's when the difficulty began, not only with the death of my grandmother, but also because soon thereafter my mother met someone who became my stepfather. And that's when the alcoholism began. Stepfather used to drink a lot and then introduced the mother into becoming an alcoholic. So he said, after that, I felt like I was mourning the death of my mother because she ceased to be the mother I knew and she became an alcoholic. And he said, and I just decided that, I didn't like being home, so I went to the streets and I made my street family. And I began doing petty thefts, and I began stealing and robbing in houses and even doing drugs here and there. And I even went to some friends' houses to do LSD and just do things that made me what I thought to be happy at that time. By the age 17, he was arrested at least 24 times. And he says, while sitting in my parole officer's car outside of my high school, my parole officer turned to me and said, Mike, if you get arrested one more time, you will be tried as an adult, and that will be the end of your life. What do you want to do with your life? So when Mike when he tells his story, he says that he was terrified. Every time he had to go to jail, he had this overwhelming sensation of being depressed immensely. And he began thinking about his life. What do I want to do with my life? But yet, without the resources, still wasn't sure what to do. But he knew he had to get away from those friends. So he got a job at a high-end furniture store where he sold to very rich and wealthy people. And he says that one day he got this client who was extremely rich. He was a pediatric surgeon who had ordered specialty furniture. So he had to go there so many times over a period of probably maybe weeks or years. And the surgeon began to actually like him, began to see something in Mike. So he began asking Mike about his life. What are you doing? And Mike tells him his story and his alcoholic mother and alcoholic father, and he basically was abandoned to the streets. But he knew that he had to do something with his life. He just didn't know how. He could barely add numbers together. He could barely read and write for his age, and he didn't know what else to do. Well, this surgeon saw something in him very special and said, Mike, well, you just need to get out there and do something. And from there, miraculously enough, a juvenile delinquent who was into drugs and all sorts of crazy things with tattoos, without much hope, according to society, actually became this man, Dr. Michael Mattis, full professor at the University of Minnesota, and also chair division of thoracic and foregut surgery. He became a very well-known surgeon and teacher, professor. It's amazing, his story, because he turned and used the passion from that surgeon who believed in him. Look at this. Check this out. Somebody's other's passion can have an effect on us. This pediatric surgeon who loved what he did, and believed in the possibility of this young man. His passion then affected his life and thus the lives of many others. It was a domino effect. So when we are passionate about something in a good aspect, it really does help a lot of people. It's amazing the acts of just one person. And probably we aren't the best storyteller in the world, but when you watch the documentary and you see Dr. Mattis tell his story, it's absolutely amazing. And when he gets to the part and you find out what he is today, you never imagine it. Passion is part of that lever, part of our utilizing our free will, our willpower, the power in our will to change our lives. It's truly amazing what we are capable of, isn't it? When we really set our minds to do something. Mike could have said, oh, my parents didn't love me. Who knows where my real biological father is? Pfft, I never saw him. Mother was an alcoholic by the time I was 11, and my stepfather as well. He could have stayed on the streets. And he could have become like many of the patients I see that are addicts, that continue to be addicts and do not want to do anything else with their lives because that is all they've ever known, and they've never, maybe didn't have the opportunity like Mike, or that's just the life that they chose. So it's amazing to see when you really decide to change your life. And Spiritism tells us, Joanna talks about when we make a change in our lives, we make a cemented change. We really put forth the effort to say, you know what? I am not going to stay in this impoverished area. I'm not going to be a product of my family from alcoholic parents. I'm going to make something of myself. Because each one of us has opportunities. We learn, as we just got done finishing a number of weeks ago, about the moral laws. We know that each one of us has the same opportunities in life. Just a matter of we taking advantage of it. Taking advantage of it in a good aspect, not in a negative one, as Michael Mattis did. This is an interesting photo. It's not of Michael Mattis, naturally, but it's of Pilate and Jesus. We talk about passions, and we talk about free will, knowing that, again, the lever of our passions is our free will. Jesus, who was passionate about what he came to bring, the message, he could have turned to Pilate and said many things, but was quite humble when he spoke to him. We all know the stories. We don't have to repeat about Pilate. In actuality, according to modern Christianity and even biblically, they say that Pilate was against Jesus. In actuality, Spiritism in the literature says that he wasn't against Jesus. He actually thought that he wasn't such a bad guy, and he even turned to some of the other officials and said, well, why are we going to crucify Jesus? I mean, you know, he's doing pretty swell stuff. But what happened? Pilate thought he had a great idea and said, well, let's bring out Barnabas. For sure, when people see Barnabas, they'll choose him, they'll crucify him, because he's a real thief and murderer and God knows what else. But of course, his plan didn't work. And people, you know, they say that Pilate, the famous line that he washed his hands of it, because probably as a politician, he didn't want to get in the middle of it. He didn't fully understand Jesus' message, although he wasn't against him. He just wasn't in that evolutionary path yet. He wasn't that evolved yet to understand who he was. But in question 9:12, and this is why we were inspired to bring this message, because Jesus was very humble and could have said a lot, but he didn't. In question 9:12, Kardec asked the question, what is the most effective means of fighting the predominance of the corporeal nature? And the Spirit's answer, practicing self-denial. So this question in layman's terms, what does that mean? Most effective means of fighting the predominance of the corporeal nature. How do I fight my instincts? Instincts are very difficult to fight, extremely. Why is that? Do we know why? Took forever to develop it? Millennia. We have been utilizing our instincts to live, to survive, to eat, to procreate. So now that I'm in this human form and I'm trying to become more evolved, I'm trying to fight against the very thing that has made me survive. But now Spiritism comes and says, well, you want to fight off the instincts, which we can't exactly fight off. We just have to diminish so they don't speak so loudly. One of the tips that we hope you go home with tonight is this. It's not our tips, it's the Spirit's tips. They say practice self-denial. This is interesting. From a scientific standpoint, from the way that our brain works, we are like hardwired to become obsessed over something, addiction, right? If you eat chocolate cake, do you ever notice that? You could eat so well for so many days, and you have that one piece of chocolate cake or Brazilian flan, and man, does that screw you up. You're like, oh, now I have a taste for this, and now I want to go eat, all different of these other things, and this and that. It just kind of spirals down. There's a physiological reason why that happens. We get into a pattern of behavior. We can create these new patterns. So although we call it self-denial, it's just a part of practicing, creating a new ritual, a new habit. So let's say if every morning I'm used to getting up and eating pancakes and bacon, and then I decide, I want to eat better, I want to do something different. So I get up and I eat oatmeal. That oatmeal doesn't taste very good. You may put some sugar in it, it tastes pretty okay, but man, am I fantasizing about my bacon and my eggs and other things. But if you continue to be persistent, and Jesus said perseverance will save you. If we continue to be persistent in practicing self-denial, we will be successful in it. It's just a matter of practice. Jesus also had evolved to the point that he was. He didn't just appear there one day. Did he? There's some philosophies that believe that angels are just created, but we know that according to Spiritism, we evolved to that point. It's nothing short of effort. There's no pill, there's no fast and easy way. We could give you 10 tips for happy living. We could do that. And it'd be useful. But we're so complex that really we should just begin with the most simplest of things. And Spiritism comes and explains to us more definitively in the Spirit's book, in the Observation of 909. And the Spirits say, every passion that brings us nearer or closer to the animal nature takes us further from the spiritual nature. And every sentiment that lifts us above the animal nature announces the predominance of spirit over matter and draws us closer to perfection. So going back to Plinius and Agrippa, who was more evolved? Well, since I didn't tell you the whole story, and if you don't know the whole story, you maybe won't be able to answer that question accurately, but for those of you who have read the book 2,000 years ago, know that answer. And based upon what I told you, for sure you have to conclude that Agrippa, the brother, did well. Maybe he couldn't combat those passionate feelings he had about Flavia, but at least he didn't cause harm to anybody. He didn't cause harm to his own self-respect. He didn't cause a dishonor to his family. He didn't cause a dishonor in the community of trying to steal his brother's wife, which would have caused a huge problem. Even though no matter what he did later on, things didn't turn out so good, but certain things have to happen anyway. Go and read the book, you know what I'm talking about. So the question is, when we read this, when the Spirits tell us that how we define passion, if it brings us to a good place and it uplifts us, great, you chose something good. But if it brings us down and closer to our animal nature, you probably didn't choose something so good. And this is not us. This is what the Spirits are telling us. So we're left with this question. What is your passion? Since we've defined it, we've come to understand it, what is our passion in our lives? Maybe we have passions, but we don't call it passions. But what is something we do every day, repeatedly, and we get joy from doing it? Sometimes it's a habit that we don't even think about we do until something happens that throws us out of that habit. Like when you travel. You're so used to showering in your own bathroom and taking for granted your own shampoo, so when you go to a hotel and you have to travel and you use their shampoo, you're like, oh, this is terrible, and you're used to using better sheets or whatever, so then you notice the difference in your habits. Or maybe you get ill And you're so used to walking down the stairs every morning, getting your newspaper and walking out. But what happens when you break your leg or you become paralyzed? Most paraplegics or quadriplegics that are recent traumas, you will always hear them say, I never knew how amazing it was to walk down the steps, get my newspaper, and walk into my car and drive off. You don't think about it. You don't think about it. We take things for granted. We were listening and we were commenting with our friends here earlier. We were listening to a comedian, and forgive me, I don't remember his name. I don't think he's too popular. But he was on a TV show, and he's being funny, but it has some truth to it. And he was saying, do you ever notice and people in airplanes and he says, man, and let's think for a second. You're in the sky like a bird. And that's a blessing. How far we've come in our evolution. But we're so used to taking things for granted. Even with our obsessive passions, we take for granted our abilities, our own willpower we misuse. We take it for granted. And if you read in the book 2,000 years ago, towards the end of the book, you hear a lot of regrets. The misuse of people's free will, how they shouldn't have done this, how they shouldn't have followed their negative passions, that they should have gone on the right road and followed the better advice. So some tips before we go. One from St. Augustine, that's in the Gospel according to Spiritism, item 23. He says that prayer is a divine mist that destroys the highest heat of the passions. The firstborn daughter of faith, it leads us to the pathway that takes us to God. So let's utilize prayer. If you find yourself unsure of which way to go, whether you're dealing with passions or not, anything, utilize prayer. Because in the Spirit's book, they tell us, whenever we pray, God always sends us the good spirits to enlighten us. It's just a matter if we're tuned in to listen. When we read the Andrea Louise books, we see that when people sincerely pray, the good spirits are always brought to them. Now, they're not always so tuned in. They aren't, perhaps maybe some of them are not ostensive mediums to actually hear the words of the spirits, but they feel the inspiration. Has it happened to some of us where we're struggling in some area and we wake up and we have a solution? Or we've been struggling about it for several days and you've been praying about it, and a few days later you have this amazing, great idea that just solves it. We don't solve it on our own, for sure. The good spirits do come to help us. But another way for us to really work on something, and this is highly used in a lot of 12-step programs, is first accept, know, and agree that you do have a problem, if you have a problem or whatever it is. So also know what your passion is. Get to know yourself. Or as the famous phrase is, know thyself. And use your passion, not only just to better yourself, but also in service to others, as the story of Mike Mattis was. Probably that pediatric surgeon had no idea that he would have such an effect on that young, troubled, juvenile boy. But he himself had enough belief in him and believed that he had the ability to go farther. Have we also been presented with those opportunities to make a difference in someone else's life just by a kind word, a kind gesture? I'll never forget a story we heard about a boy who also was at risk, not famous, just an everyday person who was being interviewed, who had gone on to college and got a degree. And he said, the interview asked him, well, you came from the slums, poverty-stricken area. What made you come out of that? I mean, statistically, most people who live in that environment, they don't go too far. What was your response? Or how did you come to be who you are today? And he said, actually, it's really interesting. He said, all my life, I heard this term, at-risk child, at-risk child. That's what I was called. Or my friends, we were always called at school by speakers who used to come in, that we were at-risk children. And he said, one day I went and met with my guidance counselor because I had some issues going on. And she turned to me and said, you're not an at-risk child. You're a child with potential. And he said, I don't know what happened that moment, but it was just those words to hear that I was something else, that I could be something greater than I was. I didn't hear it before. He said, after that, I got it into my head obsessively, he said, and I just knew, you know what? I have potential. She says, I have potential. I didn't hear that. Growing up in a house where people smoked crack, I didn't hear that. You have potential. So our words and the service and the impact we have on others is pretty great. Joanna Diem just always says that whether we choose to acknowledge it or not, we influence one another. For good or for bad, but we influence one another. That's a great responsibility when we think about it. If I influence you, and I influence you to do something bad, I'm responsible for the bad that you do. You're responsible for the bad that you do, and I'm responsible for the bad that you did. So I become an accomplice. But the opposite is also true. If I'm passionate and I feel good about something I'm doing and I share that with you, and then you become passionate about it and you want to change, then that's good. I take part in your change, and you take part in your change. And this is said in modern science and psychology, and social psychologists talk about this. This is not just Spiritism. So we're talking about building stronger moral muscle. I know it's been mentioned here before. How do we build more muscle to go to this spiritual gym? One way the spirits have told us, practice self-denial. If we have a problem area where we excessively like to do something that we have recognized at some point during the talk today, maybe you thought to yourself, oh, I think I have an obsessive passion. It's not too big, but it's kind of affecting my life. I need to change. What's the first step? Well, the spirits tell us, self-denial. Deny yourself that thing. As long as it's not a detriment to your health, but deny it. Does it make sense? Good and bad passions? The ultimate passionate, if we can say, person that came to this earth, we know is our governor, Jesus. And we are truly passionate in the work of good. We know that we change many lives. In 3 years, he changed humanity as we know it, and still reverberates today. Unfortunately, the level that we are at, he was crucified and still is, in so many ways, crucified today. So we know that the path of goodness is not easy. And when you change, Joanna talks about this, it's amazing. When you start to change, especially in the beginning, you say, okay, I'm gonna do better, I'm gonna lose some weight, I'm gonna stop the gambling, or I'm gonna stop the gossiping, or I'm gonna stop doing this or that. It's amazing. People appear in your life, say, come on, let's go to the casino this weekend, who never asked you before. But all of a sudden, why does that happen? We know that the lower entity spirits who don't like to lose their slave, they start using other people to bring into your life. Come on, Chris, let's go do this. And they never showed up before. But Joanna talks about it. It's an actual fact. That does happen. You know why that happens?
To test you?
To test us. Joanna says is to see how strong our will really is, how serious we are about changing. And they say most people yo-yo in and out of different things because their willpower is weak. Our willpower is weak. But Joanna says, the spirits say, Andrea Louise shares with us, that if we use our strong willpower, which is our lever, and persevere no matter how difficult it is, keep going. Can we imagine if that, how shall we put it, scandal, is another nice way to put it, had happened in Brazil with Chico and Divaldo? Can you imagine if both of them were like, forget the Spiritism, look at this, look what happened to me. We're going to stop. Can you imagine if they had stopped? They said, I'm done. This is not worth it. I'm unhappy. I'm suffering. People are throwing stones at me. But they persevered. That was their harmonious passion. So these are the thoughts we should think about. What harmonious passions do we want to cultivate in our lives? Because oftentimes we can't just make our lower instincts disappear, but what the spirits tell us, what is good and helpful is if we make all our virtues, all our positive aspects of our lives speak louder, we do more of that, work on these harmonious passions. Whether it's volunteerism, choosing to help someone, even if you just say, I'm going to choose to help someone every day, once a day, whoever it is, we are setting a new habit for ourselves, utilizing that lever of passion for the good. And remember, when we change, it has a multiple effect. I change myself, I affect others around us. So these are the tips we leave you with. We hope this was understandable and enlightening as it was for us when we did this research. If you do have any questions or comment afterwards, you can come to us and we will gladly speak to you. Otherwise, we will pass it along to Leo.